Live from the Washington, D.C. area, it's the Inside Scoop. All the news that our viewers want to know. Now, here's the host.
Hi, welcome to the Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Morgan Jameson. Today we are joined by Delegate Marcus Simon, who's the chairman of the Privileges and Elections Committee in the House of Delegates and also serves on the Virginia Redistricting Commission. Delegate, thank you so much for joining us.
Morgan, it's always a pleasure to be with you and be on the Inside Scoop. I'm happy to take a turn on the guest side of the screen today after guest hosting a couple times in December. So this will be more fun, I think, for me and more work for you, but that's all right.
Well, I'm glad that you're here, and thank you so much for driving into these things. As our guests know, we are currently pre-recording. Today was the first day of in-person absentee voting, or I guess we just call that early voting now. Is that the case?
You know, it's really exciting here in Virginia that we really are an early voting state. When Democrats took over the House of Delegates and the Senate, the General Assembly in 2020, the first thing we did, HB 1, in fact, was to say we're going to change the paradigm for voting in Virginia. Up until 2020, the assumption was that you had to figure out how to get to the polling place on election day unless you had a really good excuse not to be there. And we've gone the other way. The first thing we said is you can vote absentee or early with no excuse in Virginia. You vote when it works for you. And we've expanded the early voting period to 45 days. So, regardless of when you're watching this episode, we're probably still fairly far out from primary day. And so it may surprise some people to know that you can already go and cast your ballot in that primary race. But the idea was we think democracy works better when more people are able to participate, and removing barriers to voter participation has been a high priority for us since we took over the General Assembly. So, we go to early voting in person at registrar's offices. You can ask for a ballot to be mailed to you. You can return it by mail. You don't have to return it by mail if you don't trust the Louis DeJoy post office or you're just worried it won't get there on time. You can take the ballot you receive in the mail, take your time filling it out at home, and return it to a drop box. Anywhere you can vote, there'll probably be a drop box there where you can drop off your ballot.
Well, that's fantastic. So how much of that needed to be legislated as opposed to the way the administration is able to execute that? I saw a notice recently that guidelines went out regarding drop boxes, which were very common themes in the 2020 general elections. But how much of that is legislated versus administrative?
Right. So we don't get too much into the weeds, or we try not to, on the specific regs for these sorts of things. Right. We passed legislation that tasks the State Board of Elections and the registrars with coming up with basically the State Board of Elections with coming up with standards to ensure the security of the drop boxes. So and you don't want that stuff written into code, because you don't want an act of the General Assembly to be required every time technology changes, or again, in different localities, what's necessary may be different. So we've given a lot of latitude to the local governments and localities to figure out how to secure their drop boxes. In Fairfax, for instance, the drop box, surprising to some people for a while, was inside because that was the only way they could secure it. Now they've got a metal one that looks like the mailbox that you can see in the picture behind me, which is secure. And most of these have actually cameras trained on them. Some of the Republicans were concerned that people would somehow try and tamper with or try and stuff them or pour bleach into them. I hesitate to talk about the things that people imagine might happen. But what we found is that none of that actually happened in the 2020 election. We're able to keep them secure. They're only around now. Many times they're only available they're only required to be available during the hours that the polls are open. So if a locality doesn't have the money or the technology or the wherewithal to train a camera on it, video camera on it, monitor it 24 hours a day, they can just pull it back inside when the polls close. And I think, in some places they feel more comfortable just assigning an election officer to sit with it and keep an eye on it that way. So we've given the localities the flexibility to make sure that they're confident in the use of the drop boxes. And it gives folks, particularly in COVID times, a way to minimize their contact and minimize their time waiting in line. If you stood in line last year, you started out 6 feet apart, but as people got anxious, maybe somebody behind you was creeping up on you 4 feet apart or 3, and you felt uncomfortable. No reason to sit in those lines. You just walk right up to the box, drop it in, and be on your way.
Now, you mentioned financial resources. If a locality can't afford to place a drop box, is that an option for them, or is that something that the Commonwealth assists them with facilitating?
Well, unfortunately, like everything else we do with elections, it's an unfunded mandate, right? I mean, there's no getting around that. But the entire election system we rely on localities to fund that with a certain exceptions. We decided to go to postage prepaid return envelopes for absentee ballots, which we funded at the state level. So we said to the localities and to the Commonwealth, particularly during COVID, we want all the envelopes that go out with the absentee ballots, the return envelopes, to be postage prepaid so that people aren't required to go out and buy even if it's only a 55-cent stamp or whatever it is. We didn't want to put that burden on the voter. And so the state set aside funds to reimburse localities for prepaid postage. But generally speaking, the cost of putting on an election is borne by localities. And so it's part of their local budget. And so having the drop boxes is a cost that's borne by them. But again, that's why we try and give them the flexibility to decide how much they want to build into it. And the standards are pretty flexible. I know in Arlington, I saw a picture of one of their early drop boxes. It was essentially a plastic paper recycling bin that they'd taken the top off of it, and they duct taped on an old briefcase with a hole in the top, a combination lock briefcase. But it was there. People could drop a ballot into it. It was inside, so it could be observed, and it was secure. And it was a low cost, sort of resourceful way of getting that done. Once that's become a permanent feature of voting. It's just like buying voting machines. The localities have to pony up the money for that. When we tell them to update the technology, they have to pay for that. The cost can be high up front, but you amortize it over the life of a drop box, and it turns out to be fairly minimal. There's even a very expensive, top of the line, $3,000 drop box, but you get to use it for election after election after election.
Well, that's really great. Now, you mentioned the pre-page postage on the return envelope. I'd like to tease that out a little bit more. As you may recall, you had a session aide in 2014 and 2015 who made that a priority of theirs. I'm curious whose legislation was that, and when did it pass?
So it actually was budget language that's gone in with Paul Krizak. Paul is on both Privileges and Elections Committee and Appropriations. So he's sort of at the nexus of voting and money. So Delegate Krizak sort of championed that cause. And so we've got budget language that went into the 2020 budget, and in our special session in 2020, actually. So our 2020 special session, we added money for it for the 2020 election, and we added the money again for the 2021 primary elections. Like everything else, I mean, the postage prepaid is a requirement now. The decision of whether the Commonwealth continues to fund it has to be made every 2 years as we put it in the budget. But once it sort of gets its way into the budget, it becomes a sort of a given that this is sort of built into the base. I think it'll continue to be part of will remain a state responsibility for the foreseeable future.
That's really great to hear. So Delegate Krizak carried that entire piece between legislative and financing through. That's fantastic. Great. Now, we have something unique happening this year where we see large number of folks who are in your body of the General Assembly running for statewide office. What is it about this year that's unique compared to other years when we don't see folks running for statewide office from the House delegates?
Well, I mean, that's a great question. I think a couple of things happened. So at the beginning of the year, actually even before, when people start to make a decision about running for office, typically, they start thinking about that usually about a year and a half, 18 months to 2 years out from the election. So it's a process. I think a lot of people coming into the 2021 year, particularly in the House of Delegates, figured that there might be an opportunity to take a free run at a statewide office without necessarily having to put their delegate office at risk, because this is a redistricting year. And in years past, decades past, I should say, right? In 2011 and in 2001, in years when we had to do the redistricting, because of the time that takes and the way the primary schedule works, typically in a redistricting year, we move the House of Delegates primaries to August. And we continue to have the statewide primaries in June because the state doesn't need to be districted, right? You're running statewide, it's statewide. And so those primaries typically would happen in June, but we wouldn't have statewide primaries until August, because the thought was by August, we'd actually have boundaries for those House of Delegate districts. And how do we have primaries before we knew what the districts were going to look like? So there's a lot of speculation. I think it's probably accurate that some of the folks from the House of Delegates that normally might have said, no, I'll just run for my House seat, I won't worry about the statewide seat, thought they might have a chance to run once in June, and then if it didn't work out, they could come back and file for their delegate seat in August. As it turns out, the census data has not yet arrived. Even as we sit here speaking in late April, early May, we still don't have any data from the census, and so we're not able to redistrict. So we're going to go ahead and run in 2021 under our existing districts, which means all the primaries, House of Delegates and statewide primaries, are happening on the same day in June. Now, what some of these folks discovered, I don't know if they went in knowing this or not, but what some of them discovered was we actually have an exception built into state law that allows you to appear on the ballot twice if you're running for statewide office. So you can be on a delegate seat and run for statewide office. You could be running for Board of Supervisors and statewide office. You can't run for delegate and Board of Supervisors. You can't run for Board of Supervisors and school board, but any of those other seats plus a statewide office you can be on twice. And so some of our members are going to be on, or would like to be on, well, they're on both primary ballots, and they hope to be on potentially on the this general election ballot in both their delegate seat and the statewide office.
So play that out for me. So they can be on the ballot for statewide plus. They can be on for a plus something else. Now, let's say somebody goes on from the House of Delegates to become a statewide nominee for either party. And they also win their House of Delegates primary, should there be one. Does that mean in November they would also appear on the ballot twice again, or is it just unique to the primary?
No, you can. The same rules apply to primary and the general election. So you could. So suppose you're running for lieutenant governor. I'm probably maybe the only member of the House who's not. It seems like, but no. But so you're running for lieutenant governor and a House of Delegates seat, and you win both your primaries. You win your House of Delegates primary, and you win your lieutenant governor primary. You could do one of two things. You could say, you know what, I really want to focus all of my energy running statewide on the lieutenant governor's race, and you could withdraw from your House of Delegates race, and then the party would have to come up with another, because the primary would have already passed, the party would have to come up with another way of replacing that person as on the House of Delegates ballot. And that happens from time to time. It happens when people withdraw. Late Chris Amundsen years ago withdrew very late in the process. Sometimes people get sick or die. And so we have a process to replace them. Or you could stay on. And then if you won your statewide race in November, presumably that's the oath that you would take. And so you would have to have a special election for the delegate seat. And that's happened, oddly enough, with people running who then became judges. Ansley Ware, that's how Sam Rasool was running for lieutenant governor. He won in a special election. Ansley ran, was elected in November, but took an appointment as a judge before he could be sworn in. So we had to have a special election between the November and the January election. So that happens from time to time.
Now, when special elections occur, and let's say it's a partisan special election or just special elections in general, who finances that? Is that a party financed operation? Is that a state or locality financed operation?
So again, if you're having to have a second nominating process because somebody who is the nominee at the primary withdraws, the party will figure out how to pay for whatever nominating process they come up with. It's not going to be a statewide. It can't be a primary again because that date is come and gone. So it could be a convention. It could be a firehouse primary. It could just be, a group of party elders getting together and nominating someone. But that cost would be borne by the party. Again, if somebody were to win both their delegate race and the delegate primary and statewide primary, the special election that might follow if you won your statewide race would be a taxpayer-funded special election.
Okay. All right. Interesting. So going back to this census data, which we can all get into why it may be delayed or otherwise, what is unique about the redistricting this year other than the delay in data that we haven't seen before in the past?
Right. So we have a number of things, sort of unprecedented things happening this decade. It's really conspired to make redistricting interesting. So first, this is our first year under a new constitutional amendment, which passed in November, which established a bipartisan combination hybrid kind of legislator-citizen redistricting commission. So we have a mostly independent commission made up of 8 legislators and 8 citizen members. It's got 4 Democratic legislators, 4 Republican legislators, 4 citizens appointed by Democratic leadership, 4 citizens appointed by Republican leadership. So the idea is to try and get everybody to cancel each other out so nobody gets a partisan advantage here. Each house gets 4 members, so 2 members from each party caucus. So I'm one of the 2 House Democrats on the Redistricting Commission, along with Dolores McQuinn from Richmond City. The Republicans have Les Adams and Margaret Ranson from the Republican caucus. The senators, you have George Barker and Mamie Locke. George is from Fairfax, Mamie Locke is from Hampton. And on the Republican side, you have Senator Steve Newman and Senator Ryan McDougall from the Senate Republican caucus. So those are the members. That's the makeup of the Redistricting Commission. And there's a lot of hurry up and wait. We got a quick timeline to appoint the members of the commission and get the commission established. We're going to have our first meeting because the thought was we'd be doing redistricting in March, really. The General Assembly would be voting on new maps probably by now if things had gone according to plan. But the other unusual thing this year is we're in a pandemic. We have a Census Bureau. We're coming off of a Republican administration that frankly didn't want to count everyone, despite what the Constitution requires in the census. And so the Biden administration's taken over, and it's kind of like if you've ever moved into an office after somebody who got fired, and you open up the desk drawers and you find that they've been stuffing all their mail and assignments and everything into a drawer, and you got to sort of sort out the mess. That's what sort of happened over at the Census Bureau. So now they need time to repair and make sure we've got good, solid and data that meets our integrity standards in Virginia or in the U.S. so that we can get data out to the states. That is projected to be available to us in raw form in mid-August at the earliest. So that's the story with the census data. It's going to get to a commission, and then the commission then has 45 days after receiving the data to create maps. The maps ultimately have to be approved, particularly the congressional maps have to be approved by the General Assembly. And then if all that goes smoothly, the earliest we're probably talking about getting all this done is put us right in the middle of election season. Again, too late to try and run a new districts this year, but the maps would come out probably in October or early November.
Okay. So, on that, when you say the General Assembly has to approve the maps, what was the purpose behind this redistricting commission? I know that there's been a lot of discussion in the past about elected officials not selecting their voters. And this seems as though even though there is this commission that sounds balanced, there's still legislators there selecting voters. But ultimately, even if there weren't, it would still go to the General Assembly to be confirmed. So how do we get around that? What are ways to ultimately take elected officials out of selecting their voters?
So, the good news, bad news about the census delay, right, is that as a matter of fact, the citizens are really getting an opportunity to to catch up with the legislators on the Redistricting Commission as far as gaining expertise, knowledge of the system, and figuring out how things work. I'll say at our very first meeting, backing up for just a second, for your viewers that don't know, I was a fairly vocal opponent of the constitutional amendment. I continued to think and believe at the time that it was a flawed process for doing redistricting for a variety of reasons. But I don't want to revisit all of that, except to say that at the first meeting, I kind of committed to trying to take a more positive outlook. Now that it's passed, that we're going to make it work. Let's see if we can make it work. Also, though, at that first meeting, if anybody wants to go back and pull the tape, it was fairly dominated by the legislators. Most of the talking was done by the legislators. We appointed citizen co-chairs because that's what the Constitution requires. But the poor co-chairs had no idea how to run a meeting, or that they would be running that meeting. It was sort of like, hey, boom, you're in charge. Here's the gavel. Run this meeting. And they're like, me, like right now? And we're like, yeah, right now. So had we been required to try and squeeze that whole process into 45 days right in the middle of February with a bunch of brand new citizen members, I think it could have been would not have gone as well as it's hopefully going to go. I mean, what we're doing now is we're taking this extra time that we have while we wait for the census data to do training sessions. We're meeting about twice a month, trying to get the citizen members up to speed. We have a meeting coming up soon called Redistricting 101, just to sort of explain to the citizen members what census block data looks like and what are the building blocks of a map and a district and a precinct and everything, so that they can really fully assert themselves when it comes time to draw the maps, right? Because they won't be beholden to the experts on the committee, which would be the legislators, which was something I was afraid might happen under the had things gone on the original schedule. So I guess the delay in census data is what I'm trying to say is a blessing in disguise, and gives us a chance to work, and it also gives more of a chance and more opportunities for citizens to weigh in. Every meeting we have, I told you we're meeting about twice a month as the cadence for the meetings. There's a public comment period at the end of all of them. And lately they've been taking up about half the meeting. So there are lots of opportunities for the public to weigh in and make themselves heard. And we're going to advocate, and I'm going to continue to advocate for more public involvement in helping us define things like communities of interest. The new legislation requires us to maintain communities of interest and keep them from being divided. And so hopefully citizens can participate in helping us figure out where those, what contiguous areas we want to keep together. Let me tell you a little bit what you asked your initial question. What problem are we trying to solve? The problem we're trying to solve is that absent this, the legislature gets to just draw the lines wherever they want. The party in charge generally, and this happens, in Maryland, Democrats do a great job of it. In Virginia, for years, Republicans have done a great job of it. But the party in charge has the flexibility to just draw the lines to their maximum advantage, and not without regard to sort of what's actually a fair-looking map. And so the thought was, and I think the reason voters overwhelmingly approved it is they know that system stinks, right? Nobody feels like that's a fair way to do it. Even if Democrats are in charge, I will say I have a little partisan here, but unlike some of our colleagues on the other side, I think we try to be fairly consistent about these things. We thought gerrymandering was bad when Republicans were doing it. I think, to be intellectually honest, a lot of folks felt like we should say the same thing when Democrats were in charge. So the commission will nobody's going to have so much leverage that we can just ram a map down the other side's throat or make them take a map they don't want. Ultimately, and I know we're running out of time for this segment, but the reason that the General Assembly has to weigh in on whatever the commission comes up with is because the federal Constitution says that the state legislatures will apportion their congressional seats, right? So when we find out how many, whether we get 11 or 12 congressional seats, the federal Constitution says it's the Virginia General Assembly that has to, dice that map, slice and dice that map. So the way we technically accomplish that is that whatever the commission comes up with has to ultimately be voted up or down by the General Assembly. And then if the General Assembly can't come up with anything, or if they can't agree to what the commission comes up with, or the commission can't agree with each other, the the Supreme Court would step in, and we've got provisions for a special master to ultimately just draw a map for us if the parties can't come together.
Interesting. Okay. So federal law is why we have to have the General Assembly ultimately enact this legislation and pass it for the redistricting. And that's less about the Virginia Constitution and more about federal law. So I think that's something unique that a lot of people don't talk about, is that there is always still a step in the process for confirmation by the legislature. Now, when we're talking about this redistricting, you mentioned that we won't get the maps potentially until October and voted on and so on and so forth. Is it possible that the people who are running for House of Delegates this year, and if we have to carry this into the other half, that's fine. Is it possible that folks who are running in those districts this year might not be living in the districts that they're ultimately going to be representing?
Yeah. So, I mean, that happens, by the way, for senators frequently, because there's an election in between. So we're going to draw new Senate districts, for instance. Even if we've done them this year, they're not up for re-election until 2023. But yeah, it's certainly possible that we adopt new districts literally, a week or two before we're elected to represent districts that look different. So it's certainly possible that I could live in a district with Rip Sullivan, and neither one of us could live in the district that our new number would correspond to, the following year. And there's a couple different ways that we might deal with that. The question is, how long do you want to let that go on? We let it go on for 2 years at a time in the Senate, because that's just the nature of their 4-year terms. There is some thought that we might want to have new elections again 1 year later. So go to, instead of waiting until 2023 to run in those new districts, that we might have to run again in 2022 and then again in 2023. So some of us are a little nervous about the prospect of having to raise funds and get out and knock doors and campaign and kiss babies and everything for 3 years in a row. But that's not a given that we'll have to do it that way. But your question is a good one. I hadn't thought of it in that context. The idea that delegates may not live in their district, and that you may have districts that have no delegate who actually lives inside those boundaries for a period of time.
Yeah, it is interesting to consider it that way, and possibly that's why some of your House colleagues are running for statewide office to put the money in the bank early. It's quite possible that they're rolling some funds over, but thank you so much for enlightening us on all of this. I am very curious about what to continue this discussion after the break about residency in district and how that all shapes up in general. So I don't want to wrap this up. Before we get to the break, is there anything that you want to try to squeeze in there before we come back?
No, I mean, I think we can talk about that, and we can talk about you raised an interesting point about the campaign finance piece, and I would love to chat a little bit about some of the campaign finance things that we're looking at. But yeah, I mean, I certainly won't speculate because these are my colleagues, but you're free to speculate on, hey, having a big statewide donor base sure is nice. And then if things don't work out, you can always, there are really no limits on rolling that money or flipping it into your house account, which is just sort of emblematic of the fact that Virginia is very much a Wild West state when it comes to campaign finance. So maybe when we get back, we can talk about some of the ways that we're going to try and rein that part of it in.
Well, thank you very much, Marcus. For those of you just tuning in, stay tuned. We're with Delegate Marcus Simon, who serves on the Privileges and Elections Committee, as well as the Redistricting Committee here in Virginia. This is Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Morgan Jameson. Catch us after the break.
Our fight against coronavirus isn't over. Let's wear face masks in public. Stay 6 feet or more from others. Follow state and local guidelines. And wash our hands frequently. Let's move forward together. Learn more at coronavirus.gov.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Hi there and welcome back. This is Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Morgan Jameson. Today we are joined by Delegate Marcus Simon, who chairs the Privileges and Elections Committee in the Virginia House of Delegates and also serves on the Redistricting Committee. Delegate, thank you for sticking around and joining us today.
Yeah, happy to be here, Morgan.
Fantastic. So before the break, we were talking about what redistricting is going to look like, and we brought up some topics such as campaign finance, including residency. And that's one that I want to jump to real quick. Is you said that there's a 2-year window that's kind of nice if you don't live in your district or if the district isn't represented by somebody who lives within it. Why would that be allowed? Is there not a residency requirement somewhere in the Virginia Code?
Sure. So in Virginia, interestingly enough, unlike Congress, and maybe some people don't know this about Congress, but in Virginia, you have to live and be a resident of the district that you represent. So to be a member of the House of Delegates, you have to be qualified to vote in the House of Delegates race in that district, meaning you have to live and maintain a full-time permanent residence there, right? You're not supposed to be able to vote in 3 different places. We have a history at times of doing a couple things redistricting wise with this and also just outside of the cycle. But in redistricting, it has happened before, particularly when partisans control the process, that you would deliberately draw someone out of their district. So somebody that was a formidable opponent on the other side, or you had 2 well-financed members of the other party, you could draw the line so that they were in the same district, and that would force one of them to have to move if they wanted to run again. There's a famously, I think, a Republican legislator who was, the Democrats did that to him and moved into a studio apartment literally across the street from the edge of his district. And they did something, once he won his election anyway, he said, can you please do a technical adjustment so that this side of the street is also in the district so I can move back with my family and so forth. So I mean, there's one aspect of that. And it's been an interesting question about how much weight we ought to give to incumbent addresses when we draw the districts. It's not part of our official criteria. Our criteria that the General Assembly adopted talks about maintaining communities of interest, making sure that African Americans and language minorities have an opportunity to select a delegate or a senator that represents their communities and somebody that they can choose. We don't want to overpack people in. But nowhere in there does it say we should worry about avoiding incumbent duplication is one way of putting it, or drawing lines around somebody's current address so that they can continue to live there. And so it'll be interesting to see. It would be helpful for us to hear from the public about what they think about how much, if any, weight we should give to where incumbents live currently. And then there's also the issue, frankly, that sort of goes a little bit with that. It's more acute in a redistricting year, but a question that has been raised from time to time about how long should someone have to live in a district in order to be able to run there? Can you move into a district and rent an apartment in somebody's basement? We had this happen with, I think, the Commonwealth's attorney's race in Loudoun, maybe a sheriff's race, where there's a big challenge to whether they actually lived there or not. They continued to maintain another residence and get their mail and probably sleep most nights at a different address, but they had a colleague who allowed them to use their address to maintain residency and run for sheriff there. So the idea of sort of shopping for a district or shopping for an address, and then if things don't work out, you lose the election, just abandoning that. One way to address that would be to have some sort of like minimum, like you have to live there for at least 6 months or a year or something like that. We don't have that currently in Virginia, but it's certainly something that people are talking about.
One of the suggestions that I heard from some of my colleagues on that topic was potentially living there for at least the period of time that the office was held. For example, House of Delegates, 2 years, Senate, 4 years, maintaining that address. And then the question gets pulled, is it the address or within the district, right? Let's say you rent and you are moving. Do you have to be within that district or maintaining that same address for that period of time? I think it's a very interesting discussion, one that, almost as complicated as campaign finance regulations that, for lack of a better phrase, Virginia doesn't have. So bringing that up, before the break, we mentioned that people can run statewide. They can run for anything and just transfer their funds so long as they report it, money in or out. Unlimited contributions from any source, so long as the person or entity is eligible to contribute. So what are some things that are happening on campaign finance reform?
So, campaign finance is another sort of difficult thing to tame. And I'm not sure, frankly, why Virginia seems to have such a hard time adopting some common sense things that happen in other states. But as you mentioned, in Virginia, there are no limits on who can contribute, except they have to be U.S. entities. So I think we have a prohibition on foreign overseas funds, but pretty much anybody can contribute any amount. It can be a corporation, it can be a publicly traded company, it can be a public service corporation, like it's the utility company that the state regulates. Anybody can contribute any amount. And on top of that, the one that really gets me and has worked me for a while is you can spend it on anything you want. You don't even have to spend it on campaigning. There's no prohibition on converting campaign funds to personal use in Virginia, except at the very end as you're winding up your campaign. So you can't go out and raise $1 million to run for governor, drop out, and then just give yourself $1 million. Well, you can, as long as you don't close your account out, right? As long as you suspend your campaign, keep your account open, you can spend that money on anything you want. So for years, I've been putting in a bill that would at least prohibit the personal use of campaign funds, or converting campaign funds to personal use, so that you at least had to spend it on your campaign or somebody's political campaign if you contributed to other people, or give it to charity, which is one of the things you can do at the end of a campaign. You just can't, spend it yourself. And for years in the House, we'd run into all kinds of reasons not to do that. Riley Ingram from downstate, he pulled out a comb that said Ingram for Delegate on it and said, I've been using this comb to brush my hair, but I paid for it with campaign funds. Would your bill make me a felon? We had Dr. John O'Bannon say, what if I'm out at on a campaign trip and I'm on the stuff and it starts raining and my shirt gets all wet? I got to go out and buy another shirt. I'm like, well, you need to go buy yourself another shirt. I don't know why the campaign would have to pay for your shirt, because you have to wear a shirt one way or the other. Anyway, we went through all those sort of hypotheticals in the House, and I think we got to a place where people kind of got it. And so my bill passed the House of Delegates 100-0. But the Senate hasn't had as many years of me putting it in, frankly, to answer those questions. And so got to the Senate, it was sort of a fresh set of hypotheticals. Well, what if I'm doing canvassing and we're having pizza at the office as a thank you for all our volunteers? Am I allowed to eat a piece of that pizza or not? My answer, of course, was, well, I think you wouldn't be there at the pizza party if you weren't a candidate for office, so you could eat it. But even if you couldn't, put in $1.50 in a can somewhere towards the pizza fund. I mean, it's not that big a deal. And who's going to prosecute you? It's a de minimis amount. But we got wrapped around things like, can you have a slice of pizza or not? Part of my thought was we have the State Board of Elections, just like the Federal Elections Commission regulates that at the federal level and puts out very specific rules and answers hypothetical questions, and then publishes the answers so people have a guide to those sorts of questions for the future. The Senate was uncomfortable passing the legislation before we had the rules in place. So that issue of personal use, along with setting some sort of campaign contribution limit. In Virginia, we've got a wealthy individual in Charlottesville who has a PAC, but doesn't even need a PAC. Sometimes doesn't even use a PAC. Donate $50,000 and $100,000 at a time to House of Delegates candidates in a primary race. As you and I know, often the budget for an entire House of Delegates primary is $150,000, $200,000. Certainly, even if that's enough money to really tip the balance in favor of one person over another. So there's some question about should an individual be allowed to essentially contribute so much money to effectively buy themselves a legislative seat or not. The problem with that one, it gets to be, how can you effectively stop it? Just putting a cap on it doesn't stop people from speaking on behalf of someone. And so the thought is, by having it all unlimited, at least we can require transparency. So all the money, everybody knows, right? Everybody knows who those people are, who's getting the money, how much they're getting it. It's all there in a public report. And then if that bothers you so much, vote for the other person is the idea. But sometimes those reports are lacking in detail. So we have a commission David Boulevard, a House resolution adopted by the Senate to have a joint commission this year to study topics like personal use of campaign funds, setting a limit on the amount of contributions, limiting the source. Should we have corporations, LLCs, publicly traded public service corporations be able to donate unlimited amounts, or should we limit some of what they can do? And then what can we do about some of what we do have dark money? Even with all of that, you have dark money because yes, I have to disclose where my proceeds come from, but if it comes from an LLC and the LLC is organized under Delaware law with some company that's called Delaware LLCs.com, it can be pretty opaque, right? Trying to figure out where that money is actually coming from. So looking at some ways to make sure that it's truly transparent. The other part of it that I know I'm just going on and on here for a second, but even the so-called transparency, because there's no auditing and nobody's really scrutinizing these things, you don't have to produce receipts for anything. You'll get things like $400 for Amazon. Well, that doesn't tell me who your credit card was charged by Amazon. It doesn't tell me what you spent the money on, right?
Exactly.
Or Wegmans, right? Well, was that you grocery shopping for your family, or was that the buns and hot dogs for a barbecue that you threw, which would be a legitimate expense? So trying to get some sort of audit in there so that not every time, but from time to time, you may have to produce those receipts, and that's going to keep folks honest, we think, in reporting only things that are legit expenses.
Well, factual accounting, just like any other business or nonprofit, and having the itemization. It's interesting that you mentioned outside spending and potential offset there or otherwise, especially with Citizens United that says what entities can do or not do. The state of Washington, specifically in Seattle, has democracy vouchers, where every registered voter receives paper money. It's not real cash, but it's a democracy voucher that they go to a candidate and say, here's my democracy. So everyone has the opportunity to participate and contribute. And that's limited to how much. So you can give it all to one, some to a few, or otherwise some, fundraisers happen to max out at that magic number that those folks are given. However, what has been seen there is an increase in outside spending. So less direct contribution, more third-party spending. So it really, is it money being spent in politics, or is it how it's being spent, how it's being identified? I think that you're on the right track there with some kind of audit or general record keeping. I think that would be helpful. So you mentioned that this has been a bill that you have put through many times, and it finally got through, especially now that you're chairing the Privileges and Elections. What else has come before you in the last 2 years that you've been chairing that committee of note that folks may or may not know about?
Yeah, so Virginia has a long history, unfortunately, of voter suppression, right? And when the Democrats took over the Virginia General Assembly, we ranked 49th in ease of voting and voter access, 49th out of 50. We're now up to 12, and I hope that we're at the top 10 pretty soon. And I'd love to be number one, the easiest, most convenient, most open place to vote. And to get there, again, one of the things, every year. Democrats would put in a no excuse absentee voting bill like the one that passed, or just little ones to create new exceptions and new excuses for people to vote. So finally seeing, that no excuse absentee voting was a big deal, but a lot of other things that we've been working on for a long time as well. Virginia, again, with that history of voter suppression, has now actually become the first Southern state, and we can say that on a lot of issues, but the first state in the South to pass a state-level Voting Rights Act. But that's actually underselling it, because we are not only the first state in the South to do this. The Voting Rights Act that we passed is the model for states everywhere. So some of the states that beat us to it, like Washington State and Massachusetts, they call their bills a state-level Voting Rights Act, but it's not as robust as what Virginia does. And so the folks that care about things like elections, folks like New Virginia Majority, the League of Women Voters, Common Cause, the ACLU, other folks that work on these issues with us, have really said that Virginia's Voting Rights Act is the model that states everywhere should adopt. Everybody should do it like Virginia. We've got the gold standard, and that's thanks in large part to the leadership on this issue of Delegate Sia Price from Newport News. We went into the session, having worked on this over the last year and a half, and some folks were a little worried that it was too ambitious. We wouldn't be able to get the Senate to go along with it. The localities might fight back too much on some of this, but Delegate Price was sort of like, well, let's go for all of it, and we can always pull back or we can always pare it down. And that turned out to be the absolute right approach. So in Virginia, localities can't do things like you see we hear these horror stories from places like Wisconsin and Michigan, but Wisconsin in particular, where in Milwaukee, they shut down like all but 5 polling places in the whole city, right? So that people couldn't find a place to vote, or they weren't voting in their normal polling place. Well, you can't change really anything about voting. You can't change precinct locations. You can't change anything without a public hearing so that everybody knows what's going on and going through a process. And in some cases, without getting clearance for the change from the Attorney General's office. So very much want to have pre-clearance of changes in voting rules and regulations and processes to make sure that nobody's trying to pull a fast one to keep people from voting. So that was sort of the whole big bill. Another bill that nobody thought we were quite ready for, and may not make me a very popular person here locally in the city of Fairfax or the town of Vienna, but we had a big bill that we finally kind of just pulled the Band-Aid off and said, we're going to move every municipal election that's held in May to November with the regular general elections. So the town of Vienna said, no, we like our election in May. And the city of Fairfax said, we like it in May for a couple of reasons. One, it keeps it nonpartisan because it's May and people aren't thinking about party stuff, and we don't want things to be partisan. But the other side of that, what they're really saying is, and the other argument was, we don't want voters to be confused. We don't want to have to talk about national issues. We want people who are really focused on local issues participating in our election, which is another way of saying we only want the right people to participate in our local elections. And that really bothered me a lot. And so my colleagues will tell you, I gave some fairly impassioned speeches, particularly inside of our caucus, because we got members getting pressured from their localities about this and getting a lot of pushback from local elected officials. But if we came to Richmond and we went about this thing, as I said at the top of the show, our philosophy is democracy works better when more people participate. And the greater participation level you have, the healthier your democracy. That goes for localities too, right? And we know that when we move the elections from May to November, far more people participate. And you look at places like the city of Richmond that had a very robust mayoral race. It was very much about local city issues. Nonpartisan, mostly all Democrats, but it was considered nonpartisan. And it was about land use. It was about Navy Hill Project. It was about policing. It was about use of force. In the middle of probably the most polarized national election, there was still an ability for people to break through on the local issues. So it can happen. It works. Senator Spruill barely got that out of the Senate. That passed on a 19-19 tie vote. We had one person out and one person who had an unfilled Republican seat. And Lieutenant Governor was able to break that tie and send it to the House. And there we kind of strong-armed it through. So some big things happening in Virginia. But the theme, right, the touchstone for all of it, the guiding principle is democracy works better when more people are able to participate. And that's our goal. We're all about opening the process to as many people as possible.
What happens when those elections are moved? What kind of trickle down effects does that have to things like charters or terms or term limits or otherwise? How are those things taken into effect?
Yeah, I mean, that's, that was one of the, I would say more legitimate, but there was certainly some questions, right, about, hey, what does this mean? Like, forget the larger piece of it. What about the logistics? How is this going to work? I was elected for a 2-year term, which expires in July 1st, and now you're telling me I can't be reelected till November. So the law says, and in Virginia, this is the beautiful thing about being the General Assembly. We can, the law is whatever we say it is, right? I mean, that's what we do. We make the law. So we said, look, those terms will be extended. So some people that got elected are going to have a 2.5, maybe a 2-year term, will get a 2.5-year term in 2022 because we've extended their term to the following January, so they can have a November election. The town charters will have to be amended, but the language says notwithstanding anything to the contrary in the charter. And so here's the way I sort of looked at that argument, right? Some people say, why are we doing this without the localities asking us to do it? Typically with town charters, changes to charters they originate with the locality. The locality has to decide, the local government decides to change the charter. They put that to a referendum. The people vote on it. We don't have a citizen initiative and referendum process in Virginia. So it can't come from the ground up. It has to come from the top down. So the people that would have to take the initiative to change the charter to move the election are the same people that benefit from the May elections. People that get elected in the city of Chesapeake, for instance, where Delegate Sproul's from, or Senator Sproul's from, that locality goes in November, it goes Democratic by wide margins all the time. Although they're technically nonpartisan, everybody will tell you 9 out of 10 members on the Chesapeake City Council are Republicans because a different electorate shows up in May. They had no incentive to ever go out and do this voluntarily. So
is that something that you think pardon my interruption, is that something that you think that might be looked at in the future, is some type of citizen-generated referenda type opportunity?
There's always that. It comes up from time to time. And occasionally, again, the General Assembly will decide if we don't want to decide on something, we'll put it to a referendum. But it would take a sort of a sea change in attitude, I think, in Virginia for us to sort of give up. I mean, there didn't need to be a big movement. It does come up from time to time. Hey, should we allow it to happen? When you look at the states where they've been doing it for a long time, it doesn't. You have dueling referenda sometimes, where if they both win, you have an intractable conflict because they both make it onto the ballot. You have a perennial, say, vote yes, vote no, back and forth over things in places like California and the Pacific Northwest. So I think, frankly, our system of kind of doing it sparingly is probably better. And we've had some time over the last 20, 25 years to test it out. And I think on balance, we're probably better off without it. Occasionally, again, we have to step in and make localities do things they don't want to. But I don't see Virginia adopting a whole lot of initiative and referenda in the future.
Now, earlier you mentioned some of the groups that worked on the Virginia Voting Rights Act, which is something that I am curious to pull a little bit further. And you mentioned some of those groups, and I'm curious to know, how is it that these groups are defined as a group versus a special interest versus a lobbyist? What is the difference between that when it's volunteer or paid or financed operations that are in some of those committee hearings and testifying without data or otherwise? When we talk about this, campaign finance reform and these special interests, what is the difference between any of those groups versus any other group that, boogeyman special interest type mentality goes around? Well, I mean,
it's hard to discern, right? I mean, part of it just takes being around for a while and being able to know who's who. And so it has to do with their tax status, right? So we have 501, everybody knows the old 501c3, right? That means that the money that you donate to a 501c3 corporation or entity is tax deductible for the donor. Those groups, under federal law and their federal tax code, aren't generally allowed to do political partisan activity. C4s are generally more issue oriented, but even those folks can't do political donations. And then you have a whole nother different categories. So sometimes you have to look at the tax status of it. Sometimes you need to look at what the funding sources are. A lot of times, again, they have to file federal documents called I-9, or I can't remember the name of the term, but there's a term, a 1090 or something, 990. We can go look at to try and figure out what their source of funding is. I will say that was sort of a challenge during the virtual session. Anybody could kind of log on and claim to represent whatever organization. When we're in person, you actually have a chance to sort of get to know the folks, right? And you see who's who. We know the Progress Virginia. I know, the executive director. I get an opportunity to ask questions. So, what is your mission? Where do you come from? Who are your board members? You can have those conversations. You see them, physically see them in the halls of the General Assembly building, and it makes it easier to build relationships. When we're virtual, again, sometimes some people pop up and you don't know who they are exactly, but you do a little bit of research, you find out that Americans for Prosperity sounds like a nice enough, innocuous enough name, right? But that's actually the Koch brothers when you start to peel back the layers of the onion. So some of it's just a matter of being down there a while, learning who's who, finding out what their particular interest is, what their pecuniary interest is. I'm getting calls all the time from voting machine manufacturers and software developers who develop voting, ranked choice voting software, who want to come meet me and talk to me all the time. So you got to always take that part of it with a grain of salt and understand what motivates somebody. And how much do they do in Virginia? Are they headquartered here? How much local interest do they have? It's always interesting when big national groups kind of want to swoop in and then take credit for an issue that Virginians have been working on, grassroots folks have been working on for decades sometimes. So it's sort of hard to always know who's who and what's what. But again, usually it's a follow the money will get you the information that you're looking for.
Okay. So you mentioned the longer you're there, the more you can get to know folks. What are your thoughts in general on term limits for all races? From, notoriously we have the only governor that can't serve 2 terms consecutively. What are your thoughts on term limits in Virginia?
It looks like we're just about out of time. I'm nosing the note. I'm not a fan of term limits. I think that when you limit legislators, you end up empowering the lobbyists because they're the ones that are there all the time and they have all the historical knowledge, and it gives them even more power to run the place. That's what we find in other states that have had term limits. So,
well, Marcus, thank you. We'll have to get you back. This is Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Morgan Jameson.